Good morning, and can I welcome everybody to the 10th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2014. Can I remind everybody present that all electronic devices should be switched off at all times because they do interfere with the broadcasting system. Today is our second evidence session on our inquiry. Today we will cover the topics of early years, childcare and employability. And to discuss the topics of early years and childcare, can I welcome to the committee our first panel of witnesses. This morning we have Jackie Brock from Children in Scotland, Carol Ball from Unison Scotland, Claire Simpson from Parenting Across Scotland, and Emily Thompson from the Women in Scotland's Economy Research Centre at Glasgow Caledonian University. So thank you very much for coming along, and thank you again also for your written submissions. Can I perhaps start the ball rolling this morning with a general question? Can I ask very briefly how important you consider childcare in terms of not only employability opportunities, but also in terms of children's welfare? Can I start perhaps with Emily?
Thank you, Chair. Childcare is incredibly important, not least because of the labour market issues that you flagged up. In the short term, it has kind of employability and productivity issues where jobs can be created in the local economy and can be spent in the local economy. But in the longer term, there's a lot of evidence that indicates that children that are well cared for and that have consistent and reliable childcare opportunities in their early years particularly grow up to be more civically engaged, are less likely to engage in sort of risky behaviours and crime, etc., etc. So they're really kind of key long-term investments which have social and productivity benefits.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's so important on a number of fronts, whether it's for the economy or for children themselves. And I think certainly, we need to put children right at the forefront of that. As Emily has said, there's huge benefits for children in childcare, and particularly in terms of inequalities. And unfortunately, in Scotland, we are riven by huge inequalities in society. And a lot of the information from growing up in Scotland shows that where there's a gap at age 3, by the age of 5, when children get to school, they're really far behind their peers in terms of cognitive development. And with childcare, good quality childcare, some of that inequality gap is ironed out and children have a better chance. And that benefit is still being shown at age 15. I think, obviously, there is also something in terms of parenting that quite often it allows, with parents who are more vulnerable, where parents are finding life difficult and with parenting their children, quite often nurseries can also identify that and be able to provide that, the support that parents need to be able to give good quality care to their children too. So its importance on a whole number of fronts, I don't think can be underestimated. I think Nicola Sturgeon called it an infrastructure issue at the Women's Employment Summit, and I think it certainly is that. It's a real infrastructure issue, and it's the glue that kind of holds our society together. We need to give it its due importance.
Thank you very much. Carol.
Thanks. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Emily in the fact that you should put children first. They have to be foremost in terms of providing childcare. I certainly have concerns that children who would be in a childcare setting for up to 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, is in the best interest as long as they have the correct resources, and I mean that in terms of the correct staffing ratios that would be able to provide that very valuable and quality-driven childcare. So it has to be absolutely the front. I do think employers, though, have to play a role here. It is not all about childcare provision. It's about employers recognising that families are important and work-life balance is important. They invest in their employees, they train them, and then a lot of, obviously, those that are already in work have to leave work because that childcare provision isn't flexible enough and doesn't provide for it. So there's a wide balance to be struck, I think, in terms of, yes, high quality, flexible provision, which is not there, and employers playing their role in providing that flexibility in their working practices to benefit the whole of society.
Thank you. Well, obviously, just to echo the comments there, but perhaps just throw in a couple of statistics. You asked about the evidence for child development and welfare in relation to childcare. There's a whole raft of evidence around the good value to the public purse in terms of early years investment, and I'm sure the committee will be well aware of that. But, for example, research from the University of Melbourne has shown that having a quality early education enables children to score up to 30 points more in their literacy and numeracy tests as they progress in primary school. It's probably no surprise that in Scotland and the UK, children from the top income quintile in households are 2.5 times more likely to attend early years childcare provision. And they're 6 times more likely to use early years in childcare provision at a full-time rate. So when you think about the huge inequity of children in attainment and achievement when they enter primary one, that inequality has begun partly because of the good quality provision that some children in higher incomes have had than those in lower income. And as you know, the attainment gap is then reinforced throughout their school journey. So I absolutely believe that childcare has to be part of the answer to really effective use of public investment in our children and their development.
A number of very interesting issues in there. I've got members who wish to come in, so I'm going to start with Colin.
I was quite interested to note that there are huge disparities in the cost of childcare. Most particularly, I'm seeing that the average fee for an hour of childcare in Scotland in 2014 is £4, but there's a difference between the average cost for a child under 2 is 80% more costly in the most expensive local authority than the cheapest. Why is that? Why the huge discrepancy in the cost?
If I could start, there are a number of reasons, and it's pretty complex, so I'll try and be as short as I can. We need to take into account issues like Scotland's geography, and it's obviously rurality, remoteness is an issue. Given our childcare market is essentially driven by the private sector, you obviously, those private nurseries are essentially small businesses, and they need to charge a rate that will enable them to function effectively as businesses. So where they don't have a significant market or where they need to charge high costs, because, for example, they have to run, because they don't have enough parents to, because the rurality might be that they need to charge a lot of money because they don't have a lot of parents available. So essentially the market can determine how much the cost is. That's one issue. Another issue is that in the local authority provision, money is passed through from Scottish Government. It is then down to the local authority to determine how much it is going to subsidise its own care, but also how much it's going to subsidise its childcare provider partners. And that will vary.
Yeah, just to emphasise Jackie's point, the issue of the market providing the majority of the childcare. I mean, we have a kind of hybrid system in Scotland at the moment. But the policies of supporting parents to purchase childcare in the market has kind of led to this patchy price, if you like, for childcare because we have local economic conditions in local areas, as Jackie outlined. So you know, there are variations in terms of local demand for services, and there are issues around the childcare market, the labour market, childcare workers. Childcare workers are paid better generally in state-provided provision. So it depends on the kind of mix at the local area how the price pans out.
I still find it difficult here because if an hour of childcare in Scotland is 2014 is £4, but in 2013 the highest was £9.40. That's a huge discrepancy. I mean, if you're talking about £4 an hour, and because of local economic conditions, because of the numbers available and so forth, and the economic forces behind it, it had to be up 25% or something. I could understand that. But I mean, £4 and £9.40, that just doesn't make sense.
The survey also hides the extent to which providers are able to charge more. For example, children of 2 and under have a certain staff ratio, which is more costly. Children who want, families that need hours out of the sort of 9 to 3 average, providers are able to charge more. If children have additional support needs, then again they will require a more intensive staff ratio, which enables them to charge more as well. We share your concern about, as it's been called by the Family and Childcare Trust, the childcare lottery of costs in Scotland, and that is true to a certain extent. But it's partly because we do have a market in childcare that is essentially determined by who can pay and what providers believe can help them to run an economical small business, as opposed to a public good, which is obviously what we're all arguing. We need to see that transformation in terms of how childcare is provided.
Sorry.
Again, so want to...
Just very quickly, I mean, to agree with both the things that have been said there, and also to say that what you're talking about there is averages. And if those are averages, even my poor mathematics would allow me to realise that there's probably an even greater disparity. It will hide, higher costs at one end and at the other. But more, what I wanted to say really was that I think all of our written submissions reflect the fact that we like to see things move from a demand-led to a supply-led model. And the reason for that is, at the moment, if you give parents or people using childcare vouchers or other ways of subsidising it, quite often what's being shown in other countries is that that model then allows providers to put their prices up to equate for that. So, we know parents are getting more, so we'll charge them more. And there are many different reasons for a supply-side model, but one of the reasons is to cut down that price, that price disparity that parents are bearing the brunt of.
It's okay. Obviously coming and representing Unison here, obviously public sector union, we would say that we would want universal provision, and we would want it provided by the public and the third sector for not-for-profit. And I think when you have that universal provision where it's not for profit, then that then can equalise the payment for childcare. I know that in my own local authority, a few years ago, they started to charge for the childcare element. Obviously, the education bit was free at point of delivery, but because of funding gaps, and it still remains more economical for parents to have that provision provided by the public sector. So I think we do need to look at those issues.
Much of the statistics I'm looking at south of the border mirror what's happening here north of the border. One thing, again, coming back to pricing, is it seems to be cheaper south of the border for childcare than it is here in Scotland. And I don't understand that either, because, yes, I can understand that there's pockets, perhaps in rural areas, where there's a higher per unit price to provide that service, and that's economics. But in the urban areas, you would expect that there is more or less parity. Why would it be more expensive up here?
I think we would hesitate to say that clearly there are differences in terms of the population there allows larger scale provision. There's more of a demand in terms of numbers. So nurseries, there's a bit more of a market there and choice, which enables a more competitive approach to pricing. But also in terms of what's more different around Scotland, we do have a reliance on grandparent care that is greater in many parts of England, in many parts of Scotland than it is in England as well. The makeup and the way in which families support their children and it is to a certain extent, I wouldn't want to overstate that,
grandparents are doing the childcare.
Well, yes, it reduces. Yes, sorry, it reduces demand, and therefore, and so we have the ability of providers to charge that bit more because to attract that.
Yes, briefly, Claire.
I think there's two things. I mean, one, as Jackie has said, and also there are a number of very big corporate providers down in England who operate on economies of scale. And I don't know whether this is the case, but as private providers, generally, wages are lower. And that probably has an effect on quality. What I would say is that while we have some answers for you, I think we are also as puzzled as you by some of the disparities. And I think it would be a really useful thing for the committee to have a look at or to recommend that there should be an investigation or some kind of, not inquiry, not another parliamentary inquiry really, but a look at what is happening in, in childcare costs, why that disparity is there.
Liam MacArthur.
Before I go back to the question, I was going to ask the point you were making, Claire Simpson, about a switch from demand to supply side. Given what Jackie said about in rural areas where obviously the ratios in terms of, or the population of parents and therefore children that are likely to take up the services is going to be smaller, how would the demand side, the supply side model you've talked about, recognise those higher costs? Would you simply see it as an exercise in factoring in a kind of a rural weighting, if you like, to the way that would work?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure, and perhaps other members of the panel may know. However, given that that is the model that works in the Nordic countries, where people always laud, I know, and we always come back to them, but they have huge issues with rurality there. I would imagine that in terms of the subsidy that's given, as you say, there is some kind of rural weighting, and perhaps, perhaps my fellow panel members may have more answers.
We would have to have some sort of weighting, given if we want a Scottish model of childcare, then it has to reflect our population and our circumstances and our context. Again, looking at other countries, not necessarily just the Scandic model, the use of our existing public assets, our schools, our community halls, etc., looking at that investment that we already have in children's and community development, we're certainly not making the best of those when they, for example, schools are empty for 13 weeks a year and after hours. So we would certainly need to be creative about existing assets. But inevitably, if we were to move, and we obviously support Claire's view about looking at supply side support, greater supply side support, we would have to have a model of funding, a resource allocation that reflects the demands. Equally, we would argue that we must look at the inequities around ability to pay as well. We would have to look at some form of subsidising those parents who are on low incomes but who need childcare in order to go to work.
I think all of you, in response to the convener's initial question, alluded to or referred to directly the issue of both quality and flexibility. I notice in the evidence supplied by Children in Scotland that it refers to the fact that more is required to be done to enable mothers particularly to use their entitlement more flexibly so that they can cover longer days rather than short daily sessions. And Jackie, you were referring earlier to those in the upper quartiles actually having pretty much full-time provision at an earlier age. If I could recall correctly, in terms of the evidence we took in the Children and Young People's Bill, there was some dispute as to whether or not those longer days were necessarily advantageous in terms of child development, etc. I wonder whether you could perhaps explain where that balance is to be struck between the flexibility that perhaps parents require in order to take on work or expand the work that they're doing, and actually the child development stuff that really should drive the childcare policy.
Flexibility, you'll have heard a lot of discussion and argument around that with the Children and Young People's Bill, and that's a crucial development that we're seeing in terms of what the government is proposing. And the very narrow perspective there is that the current provision for children at 3, which is essentially 2.5 hours of a morning or 2.5 hours, is simply not good enough for really any families, but certainly not parents who need flexible hours in order to also maintain their work. So we were arguing that, for example, and many of us, in fact, were arguing that the flexibility, for example, in terms of taking your hours entitlement in a 2.5 days a week, as opposed to spread across the 5, or 2 long days, might be better served, that balance, enabling parents to balance their family and working lives commitments, is what we were arguing. But that was the sort of, that's very close to what we'll be able to get in Scotland in terms of using those 600 hours. We've made real progress through the bill. But what we're all arguing for, and I hope the committee will also want to see, is that really, is the current funding model sustainable if we're going to look at what we're all aspiring to, which is a good quality childcare system for over 52 weeks a year. And so, Liam, I think you've actually touched on the heart of what is an issue for us and a real challenge for Children in Scotland and our partners, in that we know that higher income households are using childcare full-time more than lower income, and those children appear to be seeing the benefits. But I would suggest to you, and it'll be interesting what you think, there is some discomfort in Scotland about thinking about providing childcare that is 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. My personal view is that we're not quite ready for that, or we certainly need to do a lot more engagement and discussion around that. And that's why Children in Scotland has launched its commission and alliance, because we've reflected very carefully the Scandic model, which does enable those long days, although that's not always taken up by families. For some reason, that has not captured, we feel, the passionate commitment of Scotland and society and our members. So we think we need to do a lot more work, actually, about what is needed in terms of both the provision of childcare and greater flexibility, but also, as we've heard, greater flexibility from employers as well. Enabling childcare to be provided 24/7 in order for us to have 0 hours contracting and more families working in this way. Is that really what we want in Scotland? Is that our aspiration? And so, sorry, I will shut up, but just to say finally, it also, the benefits of good quality childcare are clear and are evidence-based. It has to be high quality, it has been, but the benefits of good quality childcare combined with a stable family life are clearly, is what the evidence says is absolutely right for children. So how we achieve that is a huge challenge for us, I think. A fantastic debate, but one that we're really, I think, at a very early stage. So.
Sorry, it's just a very small point. I really agree with what Jackie said, but some of I think there's a difference between somewhere to kind of park your children while you work for 10 hours a day or whatever, and a place where children can be nourished and developed. And I think that some of the perhaps negative aspects that are being referred to in terms of children being in full-time care, for example, is that children do better if they're looked after by the same people. Is my understanding, over a period of time. And what we have at the moment in the childcare labour market is very high turnover, very low rates of pay that don't really foster those kind of relationships between children and carers. So I think if we kind of have this idea that more childcare isn't necessarily better, but I think if the quality was increased, we could start to see that as a positive benefit, as a positive thing.
Yeah, I think two things, I suppose, echoing what people have said, but around the edges of childcare. One of the things about childcare, as people have very correctly identified, is the high quality and the impact on children's children's learning. But one of the reasons, obviously, that a lot of parents, particularly a lot of mothers, and particularly a lot of single mothers use it, is as a way into work, as a way into education, and as a way out of poverty. Quite often at the moment it's not achieving those purposes either, but we have to think about childcare not in isolation, but as people have said, in the context of a very changing labour market, and quite often one that isn't actually conducive to anyone's health, whether it's family health, individual parents and so on. That kind of 0 hours contract, or I was talking earlier about being at the Women's Employment Summit, which I think was a couple of years ago. And one young woman, and you know, in one way you kind of take your hat off to her. She was really trying, very young parent. She really wanted to better herself for herself, but for her family, so she could work for her daughter, so she could work her way out of poverty. And she sat and she said, well, you know, I'm going out to university at 8 o'clock and I'm finishing at 4. And then I've got a job in a call centre till 10 o'clock. So I need childcare from 8 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. And you can see why she thought that. What she needed, actually, was better funding for a university place and was not to have to do, you know, a very difficult job afterwards too. The other point I'd make, and it's in our written evidence from Parenting Across Scotland, I just wanted to say that in terms of flexibility in the bill, I think that the offer there of consultation with parents, or the statutory duty that local authorities will have to consult with parents, offers us some very real opportunities that we shouldn't lose. We should make sure that that consultation is well resourced and well funded, and that actually next year when local authorities have to do it, that there are models of good practice that allow us to gather Scotland-wide information about what parents want and what is needed that will inform our future development of childcare. And I would say particularly there around out-of-school childcare provision, which we know less about and which is not in legislation at the minute.
Yep, just very briefly, I mean, in terms of flexibility, I just want to give you an example of a friend of mine who uses a childminder and their child is in a nursery school provision. But because the nursery school provision doesn't open till 8:30, she has to drop the child off at the childminder, who then takes the child to the nursery provision that's free, and then obviously has to pay the childminder, quite rightly, for the whole day, but therefore so that free provision, which is quality and they absolutely respect the fact the child's getting the mixing with more children, etc. But they're actually, it's not cost effective. It's not saving that family any money by that, you know, inflexibility. So as I'm looking at that, and Jackie obviously mentioned the 600 hours and the 2.5 days. Now that, in a sense, you can see, because there's a lot more women who choose to work job share, but to provide that service, then it means that that's double the amount of children that could be attending that childcare setting, because there would be children coming at the beginning of the week, children coming at the end of the week. So therefore there is an impact on the workforce in providing that service, because they're having to work with more children than they would normally do. So there's a real whole impact that you have to look around about all of that to get the correct provision.
So just so I understand that, just so I'm clear, Carol, how are they working with more children? I mean, effectively, maybe different children and maybe differently organised, but the overall number of hours that are being covered are the same for the individual workers, are they not?
Okay, yeah, I will explain this. It's good. Okay, if you take the staffing ratio as it is just now for children who attend nursery for more than 4 hours, the ratio for 3 to 5-year-olds is 1 to 8. So in that nursery, that key worker, if all those children are attending that full-time place, they work with 8 children. So they plan for 8 children. They then assess 8 children's learning. They take their learning forward. So everything around that is for 8 children. You then move to a nursery school where it would provide a morning and afternoon place only, and the ratio then increases to 1 to 10, because if the child's not in that placement for over 4 hours, it can be 1 to 10. So if it was a purely part-time nursery, they could have 20 children, 10 in the morning, 10 in the afternoon. So they've got 20 children they have to plan for. They have to create the learning environment and take their learning and write reports on their progress. Now, as well as that, in some settings, the head of that nursery is included in the staffing ratio, and quite rightly shouldn't be, as we would say. So therefore, their 10 children is then divided amongst the rest of the staff, so that could be 24. So you could have in one setting staff working with 8 children, but in another, if it was a purely part-time, 24 children. So that increases the workload for people, you know, for the worker that's having to deal with those children. So if you start to do the day part of the day and part of the day, I mean, you could actually have staff dealing with a lot more children than what teachers are dealing in classes. So you really need to be careful about the impact of creating flexibility. Flexibility is fine as long as you provide the staffing models that that will be able to ensure the quality and not just the quantity.
Thank you very much. I've got quite a number of members who want to come in, so if members could be brief on their questions and relatively brief on the answers, that would be very helpful. Can I start with Jane Baxter, and then we'll move to Joan.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks to Carol for answering the question I was going to ask, because that's been raised with me quite often by Unison members in Fife. And families make their own decisions based on the flexibility they need, and I say that as a granny who provides care, I should declare an interest. I am that granny a lot of the time. 28% of childcare is provided in the private sector, and I've got a press release in my hand here from the National Day Nurseries Association, who are saying that the childcare plans that are being proposed by the government are unworkable without more funds. And we've heard lots of references this morning to the need for funding and the need for resources. And it looks as if, Colin raised questions about the difference in cost, it looks as if private nurseries are almost subsidising the places that are funded by the government. So is that an issue for the whole sector? Is it only for the private nurseries? What about the families who have to rely on those private nurseries? How are we going to make this childcare guarantee workable? Or is it workable as it stands just now? Are they wrong? Is the National Day Association misguided?
I mean, I can only talk from a public sector perspective, because that's who I'm here speaking on behalf. I mean, I do think it should be provided by. I do think early years education and childcare should be provided by the public sector. It should be funded. It should be funded. Children belong to society. Of course, they belong to their parents first, but we all have an interest in children. So, therefore, I think we've all got a responsibility to pay to ensure that they, get the highest quality provision. I mean, I do think in terms of costs, I mean, if you look actually at the costs of delivering this service, even across the public sector, because it's coming up, believe it or not, to the 10th anniversary of the nursery nurse dispute, I'm sure you're all interested in hearing that, we're actually having a day, and so we've done a bit of initial research into where we are now. So we've looked at what the salaries are for nursery nurses, and their names have changed throughout the authorities, and that ranges from 24,500 to 16,500. So there is a 50% gap in the salaries of childcare workers just now, and that, as I say, in the public sector. I wouldn't hazard a guess as to what that gap would be in the private sector. So we need to look at this and say, if you want high quality, you have to pay for it. We absolutely agree that the workforce is now registered with the SSSC, and they have to have a qualification. But with that responsibility and with that high quality, there has to be a payment for it. So, I mean, I do think to cut the cost shouldn't be for profit and should be provided by the public sector.
Emily.
Yeah, just very briefly, the price of childcare doesn't always, in a private provision scenario, the price doesn't necessarily reflect the cost of delivery. The price reflects the cost of delivery plus the profit. So, if we thought about different scenarios, if we thought about public provision, then we may be able to provide. We'd have to pay for the quality, more staff, better trained staff, etc., but we might be able to benefit from economies of scale, for example, in provision and long-term investment. So, yeah, I think I definitely agree with the idea that, if we want the quality, we have to pay for it. But under the kind of market provision, the cost doesn't always, the price doesn't always reflect the actual cost of delivery.
I think I'd have to add that what we have in many parts of Scotland is a fantastic network, if you like, generally spearheaded by the local authority, but an effective patchwork of services around, which includes the private sector, and you can define that by both the provision of private nurseries but also childminders as well. Those combined with the state providers and also Out of School Club, there's a lot that's good about that, and they can provide that flexibility that we're looking for. But I think Emily's earlier points about actually what we need in the child's interests and also the families is reliable and stable provision. So are you going to get that when you have a system that, where it works well, may well have a number of partners that are involved in the provision from the private sector, third sector and the public sector, but actually one that is too expensive because you're asking about the cost. And I think we would argue that already it is very high cost. How can we better use the just under £1 billion that's spent in Scotland alone, and that doesn't include the tax breaks money that we get via the UK? Can we use that in a better way? Now, I can't give you the list of how we could do that, but we're convinced that given the system really only works now for families that are relatively well off, who live in the right areas where there is provision, we undoubtedly could use that money better. But how much else we might then need to invest in order to deliver the good quality that we're talking about, we still think is again an area that your committee, I'm sure, could do a lot of good work in terms of helping us identify some of those answers.
Alpine, followed by Mary Scanlon.
Quality. You'll be aware that in terms of rolling out the 600 hours and then moving on to the 1,140 hours of childcare, the Children's Minister has asked Professor Iram Siraj to have a look at the staffing and the training of staff. And is that something that you would welcome?
Absolutely. It's fantastic to have such a renowned expert coming to look at the Scotland's workforce and the needs there is a fantastic move by the government. I think we also would want that review to build on the success already, for example, in terms of the qualifications that are now required. The degree level quality is again a fantastic step forward that we've seen in childcare. Also, our high standards around registration is something to celebrate and build on. Where I think what would be really exciting from the workforce review is thinking about how we can make sure that childcare becomes a high quality, a highly an area of work that people aspire to from a range of sectors. Those young people going to either leaving school but also leaving college and also university. It really needs to become, as it is in other areas, a highly desirable skill and career.
I echo what Jackie says, and I think we, to some extent we already have quality. I think there's probably quite a lot of disparity across sectors. And I certainly have been talking to a number of people, workforce from the childcare sector. And one of the things that I'm incredibly impressed by is the dedication that they have. And people believe in different models or, have different gurus that they wish to sort of have children-centred education. But I think I really feel that Professor, I've forgotten her name, sorry, Siraj, sorry, really has to go and talk to childcare providers, not just the kind of nursery providers, but actually the people working on the ground about what the beliefs are, to make sure that, that the good work that they're already doing is recognised and some of their thoughts are captured. And again, just some of the points that Emily's made and that Carol's made about actually, if we've got a childcare sector where at a parliamentary event that we held about flexible working, there were a number of parents there who were talking, they were people who worked in the childcare sector, and they were talking about how they had to leave their jobs in childcare because they couldn't afford their own childcare. I mean, that is a ludicrous situation, and a situation that we can't allow to exist. And although it's actually about low wages, it's also about quality. I think if you're being paid peanuts, why would you put in the effort? I mean, you would put in the effort for children, but really we have to, part of the quality, I think, is the remuneration. And I think that, you know, in order to reflect diversity, we need more men in the childcare sector. I think one of the reasons we don't have more men in the childcare sector is people wouldn't work for the money that some childcare workers get.
Yeah, and that was the point that I wanted to make, was that this, looking at the labour market for childcare, gives us an opportunity to think about how we would encourage more men into it, because it's an entirely feminised workforce at the moment. I think 97% of childcare workers are female, and I think 100% of childminders are female at the moment in Scotland. And the low pay is one of the key aspects, because there are a lot of social barriers to men undertaking jobs in nurseries, for example. And you know, you wouldn't want to overcome or to face those challenges to earn the minimum wage, for example. You know, and I think from a wider perspective, trying to encourage more men into the labour market for childcare would kind of help to break that social expectation that women are the providers of care. You know, it would give us an opportunity to think more about care in a wider sense, that it's a social aspect. Childcare is a merit good. So I think it gives us a kind of key opportunity to think about trying to encourage men into the labour force, and increasing the wages and professionalising the labour market is a key way to do that, I think, or something that would help with that, at least.
I noticed that this...
Sorry. Just When I first became a nursery nurse, because that's what my job is, that was 32 years ago, and I had to have a 2-year qualification. I had to hold that qualification, so most of the members in public sector had always been qualified. And I think our frustration in the last 10 years, when we had the last review, was about that we felt that we were being held back until the private and public and voluntary sector kind of caught up in that sense, because not all had to have a qualification. So I think, you know, we are starting from a very good base, because I think what was said at an event Children in Scotland had last week, where 80% of the workforce do have qualifications now. And I think, though, for us, I do believe that there needs to be more streamlining of them. I think there's too many routes into that, so I think it would be really good if we could have a more streamlined qualification for the workforce. And Unison fully supported the BA qualification. We support that it should be an HND at practitioner level, and it should be an HNC at support level. There should be that. The base level of qualification should be at level 3 and not lower. That's our view.
Thank you very much. That kind of leads me quite neatly on to the next point that I was going to make. And I had noticed that last week there was a problem down south, where Cathy Nutbrown, who had been asked by the government to make recommendations on the training of childcare workers, her recommendations were rejected. She wanted a minimum of 50% staff at level 3 and going up to 70% staff at level 3 and 100% by 2022. Is it your perception that we're going in a different direction in Scotland from that direction down south?
I'm not sure if we're going in a different direction, but I think in terms of our qualification base, it's always been higher than down south. I mean, I think there has been a greater level of unqualified staff, because, as I say, it used to be that 50% that were were allowed to be unqualified. I don't buy into this argument, though, that if you've got if the higher your qualification, the more children you can deal with. I don't know where that evidence comes from and how that equates at all. So I certainly wouldn't buy into that. But I do agree, and certainly would agree that, you know, as I've said, that the minimum qualification should be at level 3. And following on something from what Emily said there, you know, in a lot of schools, and this isn't the case now, but in a lot of schools, if you were deemed not to be academic, you were told you could either get into hairdressing or childcare. And I think that attitude needs to stop. I think it is about saying that this is a very important
important job, and it's not that. And it's, if you're a woman, you must be good at it. I think we've got a long way to change these perceptions, but by obviously professionalising the workforce, paying them decent salaries, and the high quality you get, certainly will improve the lives of the workers and certainly improve the lives of the children.
Lady Scanlon. Well, if you're brief and Nancy's brief.
Yeah, it seems to me that from what you're saying, if you're talking about professionalising the workforce in terms of higher wages and higher qualifications, then that will lead to higher income tax coming back to actually sustain the whole system. Yeah, would you agree with that? Yeah.
Okay,
my colleague from the Audit Committee is very good at the figures, and he highlighted that in Scotland childcare costs are higher than other parts of the UK. I've just looked at the white paper, and it says although these costs are currently lower in Scotland than in England, parents in Scotland still spend around 27%. So the white paper says that childcare costs are lower in Scotland than England, but Colin Beattie and also Parenting Scotland and various others say childcare costs are higher. So who's right?
Sorry.
It wasn't meant as a joke. It was
No. I think we'd have to look again at the sources that have both been used, but the Family and Childcare Trust is a very good source, but it is based on returns by local authorities and others. Whereas the evidence used elsewhere has looked at a different way of measuring, and remember the use of averages as well. So I wouldn't like to say either is wrong, but I think again, as Claire said earlier, some more detailed, in-depth looks at the actual costs of childcare, both providing childcare but also the charge to the parents, would be very helpful, and looking at that at a regional level and being able to understand, get behind some of the reasons for the disparities.
I think it's an important point.
Yes.
And I'm fairly new to this committee, but everything I've read about childcare, and someone in my family works in childcare in the private sector, but everything that I've ever read about childcare says that it's higher in Scotland, and this is the only reference to say it's lower. Can that be explained away by picking up different stats? Or, I don't understand. I really don't understand your answer. How you could use different figures and different averages, and suddenly 99% sources seem to say it's higher. White paper says it's lower.
I'm very happy to go back and look at the sources that have been used by Scotland's within the white paper. What I would just suggest, though, is that the Family and Childcare Trust work, it highlights a lot of issues, but it doesn't quite, and it states that it doesn't get underneath some of the real costs, and it's based on the returns by local authorities, which are based on averages and are not complete. So I certainly wouldn't. I would strongly advise you not to go away thinking that the white paper might have got it wrong until there's a more detailed look.
Colin Beattie, and I did listen carefully. Mm-hmm. You know, no one disputed the figures that Colin Beattie raised, and I do happen to know he is an auditor. I mean, I do respect his approach to figures, but none of you disputed Colin's point.
I think what we said, what certainly I was answering anyway, I won't speak for others, was that why can they be? We were asked about, so for example, £9. Well, some of the reasons why they can be more expensive in Scotland are for the reasons I gave earlier. But I think we really should look at the evidences and look at the different bases on which those claims are being made. It is absolutely quite. I totally understand your complexity.
It's very helpful to get accurate information
Indeed.
From whichever source.
Indeed.
My second question, Convener. I noticed, Claire, you mentioned good quality childcare, and Carol, you mentioned correct staffing ratios, etc. Now, the Scottish Social Services Council, every childcare worker has to be registered, and not only do they have to be registered, but they either have to have a qualification or they have to be studying for a qualification. And I know within my family that everyone in the private nursery has an HNC and more than half are going for the BA by distance learning. But what no one has mentioned today, and I get the impression that it's public sector good, private sector bad. Now, and I think there's good and bad practice in both sectors. To be fair, we get all the reports from nurseries as MSPs, and I certainly read mine fairly diligently. But if there were poor quality standards that did not aspire to the standards set by the Care Inspectorate, they're closed down. So how can you say one is good and one is bad? Whether it's public, private or voluntary sector, they all have to aspire to the same quality standards as set out, monitored, audited and inspected by the Care Inspectorate. So if they are not ensuring that the standards are the same across the board, are the Care Inspectorate not doing their job right by allowing nurseries with poorer standards to stay open? It's the same argument for care homes for the elderly, and they're certainly they've become more rigorous there in recent years. Is there a concern there that the Care Inspectorate are turning a blind eye to poor standards? Are they not doing their job right?
Absolutely would refute anything that any of us have said that would suggest that the Care Commission isn't doing its job properly. In fact, I think the Care Commission has been a driver for improvement and change in ours. And I would also regret any impression, certainly that if I gave that, others can speak for themselves, that we were saying public all good, private all bad. Absolutely not. The point we were trying to make is that if we're trying to improve the public value for the investment in childcare at the moment, and if we're also concerned to make sure that we have the best quality childcare service for all our children, then the way in which we're funding the system, which leads to the over-reliance on the private, on the market, the ability of parents to pay and to find the right provider, then we're simply not going to have the childcare system that will meet our aspirations to have the best possible system for our children.
And then Emily.
Yeah. Again, I think the Care Inspectorate actually has been something that has driven up quality, both in terms of, professional standards for people working in the industry, but also in terms of quality of nurseries and so on. And I think that it's really difficult when you talk about the kind of mix, because obviously there's public sector which is good, private sector which is good. As you said, in each sector there are examples of very good practice and not so good practice, and what we want is quality in all sectors. And I think there's a real, in terms of sort of private sector provision, I think that there is a real case, particularly when Scottish Government, in the Children and Young People's Act, extended the provision to vulnerable twos. I think that actually, particularly in that case, we have to think very carefully about how we make that provision. Because I think in kind of a full-day nursery, I think there are sometimes, particularly with vulnerable twos, opportunities where, say, childminders, community childminders, may be a much more appropriate way of delivering that support to those children. So I think actually the mix is good. I think Care Inspectorate have driven up standards, and when we're talking about quality, we certainly see them as one of the insurances of policy of quality.
Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I guess I'm here to talk about the macroeconomic arguments for childcare, and the economic evidence indicates that childcare as a merit good, if provided entirely by the market, is not likely to provide the sort of socially optimal level of provision. And all of the economic benefits of childcare are kind of increased when there's a public provision, and when we can target, for example, provision in disadvantaged areas where the kind of multiplier effects of investment in childcare services are likely to be greater and are likely to have positive kind of externalities in terms of the local labour market and in terms of stimulating local demand. So from that perspective, I would suggest that public provision has benefits over market provision. But even in kind of Nordic states, for example, we don't have entirely public provision. There are pockets of market and third sector provision as well. So it's just in terms of the balance. It's always a mix, but it's in terms of the balance of the mix.
I have another very brief question. There's a lot of members.
Well, no, Convener, it's just a very brief point. Actually, I represent the Highlands and Islands, and the councils tend to provide nurseries where there are economies of scale, and it is the private sector that picks them up where there are very few economies of scale. In fact, many children wouldn't go to nursery at all if it weren't for the private and third sector providers. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Colin wanted, I think, a very brief supplementary, and I emphasise very brief, Colin.
Yes, please. Just want to come back on that point which Mary Scanlon actually highlighted in connection with the costs of Scotland being higher than the rest of the UK. Just to be clear, I was actually referencing the submission from Parenting Across Scotland, which is page 7 of the written submissions, where it states that in the UK as a whole, childcare costs are the highest for any OECD country, with the exception of Switzerland, and in Scotland in particular, childcare costs are higher than other parts of the UK. Now, clearly, there are different ways of producing these figures, different segments of the childcare market and so on. So that particular reference to childcare costs was the FACT report 2014. Obviously, we don't know how that was constructed, but certainly it was something that I was keen to ask in view of the high childcare costs that we're seeing in relation to parts of Scotland.
So, very briefly, just to say that the costs that I quoted here were from the OECD Family Database, and then from the Family and Childcare Trust 2014, which of course had not been written when the white paper had been written, so there may be some disparity there. But I would also say, as you say, the cost argument is really complex. We would appreciate people looking at it further. What we were looking at there was particularly the cost to parents at the point of payment, and then you can look at it in other ways. You can look at the cost of delivery and how much is spent. This was the cost to parents.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Neil Bibby.
Thanks. Just wanted to ask Jackie a question in relation to what was in Children in Scotland's written evidence. You say that you've asked for further details from the Scottish Government on costings and other details around the white paper childcare policies. Just wondered if you could expand for us on those issues and what are the other details that you've questioned.
Well, obviously we welcome. It's been a significant milestone, I think, for us in the childcare sector, thinking about trying to get greater support from government around childcare. So the white paper has been a tremendous step forward, and indeed across the political spectrum, the way in which childcare has become such an issue of importance is hugely welcomed, and we're looking forward to moving on further with you on that in terms of even more sort of radical solutions, I hope, on the lines of what you've heard today. What we wanted to know following the Children and Young People's Bill and discussions were thinking around some of the extension to 2-year-olds. There is, we think, still the need for greater clarity around how the definitions of workless households, those in need, how are they going to get that support, and what are the definitions? What about those moving in and out of work? What about indeed low-income families as well, those on a low income from their work? We're also keen to have more detail. So there's a whole sort of cluster of issues there around costings and eligibility. We're also keen to know more about the workforce review. We're keen to see the remit. We're keen to see how providers, organisations like ourselves, etc., could be involved and could contribute to that. And we're also keen to think about these sort of quality issues as well. For example, in terms of the 600 hours and the flexibility and the need, the quality issues for the reliable and stable provision, we are getting a number of concerns from local authorities about will there be enough people to provide the extension to 600 hours and beyond in 2014 and in 2015. We're keen to know how we will ensure that local authorities can meet those commitments, the statutory commitments, and also what will the impact be on the wider market. We've talked about the positive benefits where you have flexibility with providers like childminders, etc. But where are the additional workforce going to come from? There are concerns that may well come from privately provided because of the much better conditions in the public sector than many, not all, private providers. So there is a number of issues around what this influx of, very welcome influx of 600 hours, what impact is it going to have on the local childcare markets that we have in Scotland?
Can I ask the panel as well, there's been a lot of discussion about you know, the economic benefits of childcare and getting particularly more women back into the workplace. Can I ask, have any of you seen any modelling that's been done that providing childcare, simply providing childcare, will lead to increased jobs for women other than in the childcare sector, as it were?
Yes, I think there's referred to in our evidence that there is some work being done in Norway, I think, that kind of tries to model the impact that it would have on employment after the introduction. I'll look it up quickly.
We're looking that up. No, we'll just wait then and Emily. She's got it. What won't be page 19 in her paper? Yeah, but won't be page 19 in her paper, surely. It's on page 19 of our document. I don't know if that helps, Emily. The document that you were emailed.
Yep. Yeah, Bryson, 2006.
I was kind of just saying in terms of the policies that have been proposed in the white paper as well. Nothing specific in terms of.
Not referred to in our submission, but there's also research for the Institute for Public Policy for the UK, which did a kind of modelling exercise in terms of how much tax revenue would be gained from women's increase in employment. We did a sort of similar analysis for Scotland, but I think it was 10 billion in terms of tax revenue was the increase in tax revenue that would come from the increase in women's employment for the UK. I think the figure was slightly less for Scotland because the data that we were working on were the average wage in Scotland is slightly lower, and the cost of childcare being slightly higher at that time meant that the impact was slightly smaller.
I guess the difference between that and what I was asking was obviously an increase in women's employment naturally would increase taxation. My question around modelling was providing the childcare increases employment. That was that in terms of the modelling. I think there's a difference there.
Yeah. I mean, that's what Bryson refers to, the paper that's referred to in the evidence. I'm just giving you the extra kind of background on what I know about what's been modelled in terms of the impact. Thanks for that.
Claire Simpson mentioned this earlier in terms of out-of-school care children and care for them, and the issue of that being on a statutory footing. I believe it's been on a statutory footing in England since 2006 as part of the Child Care Act of 2006. Why is it important that Scotland should have similar legislation, and why do you think that the Scottish Government has shied away from putting out-of-school care on a statutory footing?
I can't say why I can't speak for the Scottish Government. I'm here to speak for Parenting Across Scotland. But what I would say in terms of why out-of-school care is important, I mean, there's obviously the benefits to children, but you know, we're talking about getting parents back into work when their children are 2 or 3 and 4, and sometimes with lone parents, they actually, you know, by law are sanctioned to go back to work at these ages anyway. But, you know, once their children start school, you still need childcare after, you know, if the school day is finishing at 3:30, 4 o'clock, which it generally does, and the working day generally finishes at 5, then of course you're not going to leave a 5-year-old from 3:30 till 6:30. So it's absolutely necessary. And then school holidays and so on. I mean, so when parents are working, they absolutely need somewhere for them to, for their children to be looked after. And one of the reasons that it's really important is that in an age of austerity, local authorities do what they have to do. If they are bound by law to deliver 600 hours, then they will deliver 600 hours. Otherwise, you know, they will be subject to certain sanctions, one would think. But if there is no statutory duty, things that they... I'm not saying that local authorities want to do this, but they are forced into certain decisions that they perhaps don't want to make at the moment. And if out-of-school care is not one of the things that they have to provide, then I think that may be the subject of some cuts. And to get parents back into work in the early years, and then once they get to school, that childcare falls off a cliff, it just doesn't make sense.
How does the childcare fall off a cliff when they go to school?
I suppose
If you're getting childcare, and let's just take the white paper example, if we were at the point where there was 1,140 hours for all 1 to 4, 5-year-olds, and then they go to school, primary school, and they go attend primary school for 1,140 hours. Sorry, where's the cliff?
Okay, sorry, what I meant by a cliff, perhaps that was over-dramatising or whatever, but what I mean in terms of childcare, and I don't see school education as childcare, but in terms of caring for children and that ability for parents then to be able to go out to work, is the bit that's either breakfast clubs or out-of-school clubs or holiday clubs. And if there is no statute that provides for their use, that you know, says local authorities have to provide them, then in an age where local authorities are struggling for finance, I think local authorities will provide what they have to by law. And that will not include, or does not currently include, out-of-school childcare. And that's why I'm concerned for its future, and I'm concerned for those parents who go out to work and need to use that provision before or after school. There already have been cuts, and there may well be future cuts in it.
You accept there's no cliff there. I mean, effectively, if children are in childcare up to, let's take the current example, 475 hours, increasing to 600 hours, and when they go to school, 1,140 hours. I know that's not childcare at school. There is no cliff. But I accept what you're saying in terms of there's no childcare before or after school, but there is no cliff in the way that you described.
Okay, I suppose if I'm thinking about it from a parent's perspective, what I'm meaning is that ability to go out to work, that not having the after-school care feels monumental and feels like a barrier, you know?
Okay, Claire Adamson. Sorry, did you want to come in there? Sorry, Carol, I apologise.
I mean, I would actually agree with Claire that in some ways for parents it does feel like a cliff edge, because at the end of the day, if you have managed to get a place in a nursery provision that provides that care from 8 in the morning till 6 at night, and that's you've sustained a job and you're in work, when you then leave that provision and go to school, even if you're going to have the same amount of hours in a school building, you would only then be there from 9 till 3 in the day, and you would only be there for 38 weeks of the year. So you have to have that wraparound care that will allow you to sustain that employment. And that is why a lot of our members who work in education work in term time contracts, which actually has the impact of reducing their salary. I mean, take for instance, an average salary for a classroom assistant who chooses to work term time. That full-time equivalent's about 17,000. By the time that's prorated to term time, part-time, it comes down to 12,000, but they see that drop of 5,000 actually it doesn't really make an economic difficulty for them, because they'd need to pay the $5,000 for childcare. So do you see what I mean? They choose to work in that setting because they don't have to pay for childcare. But it keeps women in low-paid jobs, and there is no career progression for these workers, because predominantly if you work in a term-time, part-time job, there's very little career progression. So there is a bit of a cliff edge if you're moving from one system to the other. But one of the good models that I think that Glasgow City Council have started to develop is their pre-12 strategy, where in their new buildings and complexes where they use the school buildings, they then have this as a pre-12 campus where they have nursery provision within that school complex, and they use the out-of-school care club, so that parents with children under the age of 12 can go to that campus and they can then get education and childcare provided for all their children at all their ages. And that's the sort of model we should be looking at. We should be looking at using school buildings, community buildings, to see how that they can be utilised and adapt. Planners should be planning when they're planning new school buildings or adapting old school buildings, to see if they can have provision for nursery in there and out of school clubs, so that all of that can be provided within the campus.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. We started this morning's session, I think it was Claire who used the term that it was huge inequality in Scotland, and the convener talked about how this was about far more than just quality childcare. It was about lifting families out of poverty. And the ambitions in the white paper are that there would be 35,000 jobs created by the childcare proposals that are there. So I'm really interested in a bit more. We've done some comparisons on costs here and talked a little bit about the Nordic models, but I'm really interested in comparing the position of the UK with the rest of Europe at this stage, with the highest childcare costs, with a low-pay economy, which is not normal, if you like, in Europe, and the zero-hour contracts, and a tax system that includes tax credits, which could be argued suppresses both paid employment and employment of the nursery nurses. Can you give us a bit of detail as to why, for the likes of in Sweden, the female employment rate is 76.8% compared to 68.6% in the UK, and that maternal employment in the likes of Denmark is at 79% for under fives, whereas we're only hitting 59% in the UK. And do you think the proposals and the ambitions, which are challenging, and I agree with that, but we've already talked about how this is, Carol, you mentioned a change in the whole attitude to childcare, if those are reasonable given the examples from the rest of Europe which are doing things differently?
Okay. Emily, I'm hoping you can maybe help us here on some of these comparisons.
Well, yeah, I think if we look at the Nordic model, we have much higher rates of female employment. But if we look at the context of what's happening, they have much more kind of gender equality in terms of, we think about who does the paid work and who does the unpaid work. We don't have a lot of data actually in Scotland about how unpaid work in the home, who does what. But if we look at the UK data at an OECD level, we see that women do the majority of the unpaid work in the household, even when they're working in the labour market. So, the idea that there's a double shift there, and that isn't as prevalent. I mean, it's still uneven, but it's not as polarised as in the Nordic region. So I think we do have to think about what happens within the household as well as what happens outside the paid employment. Because at the end of the day, if you're not out working in the paid employment and you have children and domestic responsibilities or elderly people to look after, you're working without pay in another scenario. So I think we have to keep it in terms of the context. And I think that the childcare provision, the idea of the kind of the universal provision in the Nordic models does away with the high marginal tax rates that are sometimes implicated, particularly in low-wage economies where there's a subsidy system there. So I think that might be part of the reason why as well.
I think we also need to take into account, obviously, Scandinavian models, but France and others as well, in relation to the amount of paid maternity and paternity leave, both for each individual parent, but also as a couple that they can take in the totality. So, yes, you do have significant subsidy from the government there to enable both parents to take paid paternity, but it does appear to lead then to parents going back into the workplace because then of the reliable, flexible, stable childcare that is available, that is largely paid for through public subsidy as well. We can again send you some handy sort of breakdowns of other nations and how they divide up. But essentially, you do need to look at that maternity paternity leave contribution. You need to look at the amount of GDP that is the percentage that is paid centrally to support childcare. And then you also need to look at employers' contributions as well, which again vary and are more generous in most other jurisdictions, not just in the Scandic nations as well. So obviously what you've done really well in your question is highlight a whole range of issues that need to be considered, because if we're really going to look at a form of childcare that really does begin to tackle the inequalities issues, in addition to looking at the good quality, high quality standard that we want to see for children.
Yeah, very small. Just the issue of kind of maternity and paternity leave. If that is when these gender roles are kind of set. When I talked about the difference between paid and unpaid work, if we have lives that start off with children understanding their fathers as well as their mothers and being there to provide care, I think that kind of resonates throughout the rest of society and throughout the way society is structured in terms of unpaid work within the household. So I think that's really what Jackie said is really key to that point about the social context and gender equality within that.
I suppose exactly what Claire said in terms of the inequality, and then when we start talking about childcare, it's sort of remembering that at One Parent Family Scotland conference last year, Naomi Eisenstadt, who set up Sure Start down in England, was saying that people often talk about childcare and they say it's not rocket science, and she said no, it's far more complex than that. Actually, and I think one of the reasons it's so complex is, we want to achieve different objectives with it. And as Jackie has pointed out, it's some of the things that go around that as well. It's the maternity leave, paternity leave, it's the employers and so on, as well, an employer's contribution in whatever way. And it may be, that is through an extra bit of flexibility. I know when my son was younger, and, just being allowed to go into work at 9:30 instead of 9 o'clock meant I could drop him off. Tiny bit of flexibility. I did work the full hours, having said that. I would just like to draw your attention to something in our submission. We've been doing a piece of work around flexible working. And in March this year, with Working Families down south and with Fathers Network Scotland, we've launched the top awards for working families in Scotland. And there will be 5 awards, but one of them is going to be the Parenting Across Scotland Award for Childcare for the employer that does something to do with childcare. Now, I suppose people will think that that could be, a creche or direct provision, but there are lots of other ways, whether it's the provision of vouchers, the provision of information. And I know certainly I was in London last year at the awards down south, and they were won by an NHS trust who had some really innovative and interesting ways of looking at what employers might do about childcare. And I think that just by this award, we really want to highlight where there is good provision in Scotland so that employers can look at it and hopefully emulate it.
Thank you. Claire? Okay. Thank you very much. Liam, you've got a brief question.
So, thank you, Convener. Jackie, earlier on, I think you were alluding to some uncertainties around the figures in relation to the delivery of what's in the Children and Young People's Act. You'll be aware that there have been concerns raised about the lack of a price tag on the childcare element of the White Paper, with the suggestion this can be paid out of women returning to the workplace, whether in the caring sector or not. But in Children in Scotland's evidence, I note that it says that countries with systems of high-quality universal provision, especially wraparound care, these are generally supported by higher levels of taxation. And it goes on to say quality provision of both early learning and childcare cannot be provided on the cheap, and this needs to be a dimension of any realistic debate. I mean, I think that to me suggests that what's being alluded to in the white paper is not facing up to the realities of what it will take to deliver something on that magnitude. Is that a fair assessment?
The white paper draws on the OECD and other sources, obviously clearly very reputable. So I think we do need to take that into account in terms of how it has then estimated the costs. I think we've got no issue, we're not the experts in this, but we have no issue with the rationale being used in relation to the commitments in the white paper to increasing the hours to 1,000 plus over 8 years in terms of taxation. It seems to be reasonable to us. No doubt others might be concerned about that, but that seemed a very reasonable basis, so it seems to be very well costed as far as we could see. The point in our evidence, though, is that we don't feel that although welcome, the proposals in the white paper don't go far enough to what we think is needed if we're going to look at a Scottish model for childcare that addresses, high quality issues for children, tackles economic inequality, and provides a real driver for economic growth and resilience. So we're looking for actually a transformational model which we think must involve looking at different ways of taxation and subsidising the cost.
Earlier to the Scandic model that I think all of us have been guilty of referring to at various stages during this morning's session. I think France was one of the other countries you mentioned. I mean, each of those would tend to also be linked in relation to levels of personal taxation. So, I mean, is that essentially what you're driving at in terms of this written submission, that it's a corollary of trying to make the progress that I suppose we're all aspiring to try and achieve here?
Again, we've mentioned the Commission and the alliance that we've formed. We don't think, and Children in Scotland certainly hasn't done enough to argue that we're already investing at UK levels £8 billion plus, in addition to the tax credits as well. We don't think we're getting good value for that. So when we look at how could we use that already significant sum better, we think we need to discuss that, and I'm sure we will come up with much better ways of investing that current money. What is the gap then between what we want to achieve in addition to what the 8 billion or our share of that could achieve? What more might we need? Yes, it might involve more taxation. We would like to just be cautious around that because we're convinced that we can achieve much better value for money from what we're currently spending.
One final question from myself to Emily. In terms of the evidence, there was some confusion earlier, I think, about the question from Neil Bibby about if you invest in childcare alone, I think was what Neil was trying to suggest, that in itself would not produce positive increases in employment other than in childcare itself.
It's not what I said. I was asking a question. I've always seen it as a modelling. Where is the modelling to suggest that an increase in childcare
would come from investment
would provide an increase in jobs?
Yep, that's what I wasn't trying to say. You didn't say that, but what I was wanting to refer to was the evidence you supplied, because it wasn't absolutely clear, I think, from your answer. But you do seem to be suggesting very clearly in your written submission, and I want to quote directly from it so that this is clear. You say, in the short run, this is about investment directly in childcare. In the short run, in the context of a stagnating economy, investing in supporting childcare and early years education serves as a stimulus to growth. The childcare sector is labour intensive, and so investment in this sector has a positive impact on employment. In turn, those who are employed spend their incomes and have a multiplier effect, creating demand for output in other sectors and stimulating further job creation. That seems to me to be suggesting from the evidence that effectively a direct investment in, you call it human capital in the previous paragraph, it does have that effect, not only in creating employment in the childcare sector itself, but also the construction sector, and then also in other sectors as people spend their wages. Is that effectively what you're saying?
Yes, because when people get more jobs, they spend their money, and they're more likely, in disadvantaged areas, as we pointed out later on in the submission, to spend their money in the local economy on local services, which in turn stimulates demand, which in turn stimulates further employment. It has a multiplied effect. And those multiplied effects are stronger in areas where we're talking about, high unemployment or multiple levels of deprivation. So it creates the childcare jobs, which stimulates demand, which then creates spin-off effects in terms of employment in other sectors.
Okay, I just wanted to clear that up. I'm very grateful for that. Obviously, I'm sure all the committee members would like to read, and I'm sure they have already read the detailed paper you submitted, including the short term, but also the medium term and the longer term impact of that investment. So thank you very much for that. Can I thank all of those who have come along this morning for the extensive evidence they have given this morning and in advance. And can I suspend briefly? This is our second evidence session of our inquiry, and as I say, we're going to cover childcare, which we've just done, and we're now going to move on to employability. Our second panel of witnesses is here to discuss that topic, and can I thank Gary Clark from the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, Ian McCaskey from the Federation for Industry Sector Skills and Standards, Maggie Morrison from CGI Scotland, and Jim Murphy from the Scottish Training Federation. Good morning to all of you. Can I thank you very much for the written submissions we've received, and again also for you taking the time to come here this morning and give us your evidence. I've got a request from a member already, so I'm going to start with Joan McAlpine.
Very much, Convener. I wanted to talk about the issue of employability and the fact that the issues around employability, different policy areas are split between reserved and devolved administrations, and I would be interested in your reflections on how that affects the ability to create a streamlined system.
I'm happy to start the ball rolling with that one. I think speaking to our members across the country, there is a feeling that when it comes to areas of employability, and particularly accessing the right level of support to employ young people in particular, they do tend to observe to us that there's a degree of complexity in the system. I think there's a complexity both within the Scottish end, there's a complexity within the UK end, and there's a complexity in the interface between the two. So I think any division in terms of responsibility there does create an element of complexity. I think the challenge for everyone, whether no matter what the constitutional status of the country, is to ensure that you have an easily navigable system for employers of all sizes to be able to access, and that effectively what we're looking for ultimately is a one-stop shop that will ensure that they are able to access the right support for their particular needs. That's easier said than done, and certainly governments north and south of the border have been wrestling with that one for years, so I don't pretend that there's any easy solutions to that, but certainly there is complexity at the moment. Partly that's due to the separations of responsibility, but irrespective of what happens in the referendum, I think there is a pressing need to ensure that we reduce complexity. I think Serene Wood's Commission is a very sensible, certainly in its interim report, is looking at some very sensible ways of addressing some of the areas with particular responsibility to vocational training and education. But there are ways of making progress. I think Serene Wood's a great example of how we might begin to do that. But yes, there is complexity and it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I probably agree with most of that. There is a raft of provision out there, both at a UK-wide perspective and locally. You mentioned in your paper the youth contract. Employers just don't know where to go to get support for a youth contract for young people, or indeed what it is. People within DWP don't understand what the Scottish dynamic is to that as well, because that's a devolved responsibility to Skills Development Scotland, who manage employability and vocational learning in Scotland as well. In addition to that, there's a further complication added whereby Scottish Government managed to secure the youth employment initiatives or incentives. That then creates competition across 32 local authorities, and not one employer can navigate 32 arrangements with local authorities to provide incentives for young people. So there's a cluttered landscape both UK-wide and indeed within Scotland. I think it's also further complicated by the division of young people versus older people in Scotland, because we are responsible for education. 16 to 18-year-olds are catered for locally, whereas 18 plus tends to be more widely, because that forms part of DWP provision. So definitely a need for some form of collaboration or combining of these resources.
Else? It's okay, you don't need to press the buttons, that'll be dealt with.
I would agree. I worked away from Scotland for a period of years and came back in 2008 and actually was on secondment to the public sector from a previous employer, and just was amazed at the complexity. I agree with everything that's been said up until this point. It's very difficult for employers to navigate, and it's difficult for the young people themselves. There's DWP, obviously Job Centre Plus, Skills Development Scotland, and then there are all the different skills councils. And just when I thought I'd got my head round the skills councils, some of them gave themselves different names as well. So it was very complicated to learn about. And I also would commend the interim Wood report in terms of the recommendations they're making to simplify it through both ends of the telescope, the young person looking for help and the employer looking to employ.
I think I echo colleagues. I think there is complexity. I think there are various ways that I know that Skills Development Scotland are trying to do with My World of Work to declutter that for the end user. And it's difficult for multinational companies to navigate 4 different systems in the 4 nations. So I think it is different, and it is different nationally. But I think there are ways to get through that, and people do try and put in with My World of Work. I think that's an excellent website to actually try and navigate the system.
Mary.
2 questions. My first one is modern apprenticeships. There's been a recent report by Audit Scotland, and off the top of my head, the funding was 60 million for 10,679 apprenticeships, and that worked out on average 5,663 per apprentice. Since then, and I welcome the 25,000, there's been an additional 15 million, which has resulted in an additional 15 million apprenticeships. So we now have 25,000 apprenticeships. If you take the additional 15 million and 15,000, the average cost, if you like, of an apprenticeship is not 5,663. If you just look at the add-on, it's 993. Is that value for money, or how is that achieved? Were we overpaying in the first place? Because we're now paying about 1/6 per apprentice if you simply look at the add-ons. I'm asking you because I don't understand it myself, and I thought perhaps someone could explain it.
I think there's complexities within the modern apprenticeship process. The arbitrary figures that are communicated there are across and correct if you just divide that raw number, but it's based on. But it's also the rest of the money is based on 16 to 18-year-olds, the age group, people who are going through apprenticeships. Sectors which vary from retail would be £1,500, £2,000 for a retail apprenticeship through to £8,500 for an engineering apprenticeship. So it's quite a flexed apprenticeship application and funding process to try and navigate as well.
Can I just clarify for my own sake as well as I'm sure other committee members, are you saying that the average figure, which I think is what Mary's given, the £5,500 and then the £1,000 figure, is not very helpful in this because of the range of costs between one end and the other end of different types of apprenticeship, and therefore the average is not necessarily giving us a clarity that we're trying to seek?
Yeah, you probably have to look at an average per sector,
right, within a sector,
by age group.
Right, okay, that's helpful. Sorry, Mary.
You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. It was 5,663, an additional 15,000. Maybe my next question then, given that there are variations across sectors, could that possibly mean that there are more level 2 apprenticeships as opposed to 3 or 4? I don't know how you can supply 15,000 for 15 million and yet 10,000 costs 60 million.
Level 2.
What's changed in the past couple of years?
The introduction of level 2 apprenticeships is a lower level qualification, and there are more than being delivered than previously was just level 3. That was part of the former Skill Seekers programme, so there has been a lessening of contribution towards the 25,000.
Okay. I think I'll just leave it at that. We've got other evidence at the Audit Committee. My second question, Convener, is quite often we talk about the length of the degree and the employability, as Joan McAlpine has just mentioned. But something that I know one or two of you on the panel have mentioned in the past is soft skills, if you like. I did hear a figure, it was actually a UK figure, which said that around 40% of graduates today have never worked. Would that be a similar figure, like part-time, bars, shops, whatever? Has there been any research done in Scotland on that figure? Is it the case that less graduates have now had some employment opportunity, part-time working, throughout their degree.
We've not done any research on on the graduate side. We have done research in terms of the employer attitudes towards skills and softer skills included in that amongst employers. We've done that in collaboration with Skills Development Scotland. We have picked up a sort of general satisfaction with the level of skills, certainly improving from where it used to be and increasing as you go through the levels of skills. So, you know, some degree of satisfaction with school leavers, better degree of satisfaction of college leavers, and a higher degree of satisfaction still with university graduates. But certainly, outside of that, there is still some employers are expressing disquiet about the lack of softer skills, or perceived lack of softer skills, because, again, it's, you know, the way we were asking the question might not be the most scientific in terms of marrying up the employers with someone who's recently employed a graduate. It may just be perceptions that people have, and we need to dig a bit deeper in order to identify how robust that data is. But I think one of the things we've been saying is that at every level of education, from schools and fairly early on in school education, right through to universities, it is important for young people to have a degree of access to the workplace, whether that's working in a part-time job when they're at college or university, or whether it's work experience at schools right the way through to college and university. As an organisation, we've been employed in, we've been engaged in delivery of some of that. We were engaged in a project called Education into Enterprise a couple of years back, where we matched up mainly college students or some university students with about 800 work experience opportunities in various parts of the country, mainly the east coast of the country. And chambers at a local level are working very closely with schools and colleges and to some extent universities as well, to ensure that there is proper work experience being built into the curriculum for excellence. So there's some good examples of work taking place across the country. I think we would want to make sure that we've got as much exposure to the workplace as possible, in order that not just that young people have those softer skills to make them work ready when they do enter full-time employment, but also that they have, particularly at the early stages of their development, a better understanding of the world of work, what it's like, and what the opportunities are to help them make their choices for further education and skills training.
Let's leave it at that.
Can I ask you? I think the changes to the Modern Apprenticeship Programme as well, around the soft skills, particularly at level 4 and level 5, where there's career skills now. And that was following, obviously, a massive review on the actual apprenticeships as a whole. We still have the core skills at level 2 and level 3, which I think are either attained through school or actually in the workplace. But then going on to the career skills, it's a choice between the candidate and also the employer and what they follow. And there is a whole range of career skills there, and I think the softer ones at that level are appropriate. And it's too early to say what the outcome is, but time will tell on that.
Just on the issue of schools and preparing young people for employability and business opportunities, you mentioned the Ian Wood report earlier, and you talked about local good practice. I think it particularly mentions the school business partnerships in areas such as Renfrewshire. I don't know if you want to explain a wee bit more about what's happening there, and also to ask you, how do we ensure that the good work that's happening in areas like Renfrewshire happens across Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've made reference to Sir Ian Wood's interim report, and two of the examples that Sir Ian brought out within that report, one was Renfrewshire Chamber of Commerce's partnership with the local council and schools, and the other one was Ayrshire Chamber of Commerce's partnership with the three local authorities in Ayrshire. Renfrewshire's example, working with Renfrewshire Council over a number of years now, every school in Renfrewshire is now a member of the local Chamber of Commerce, and in return the Chamber of Commerce engages directly with its members and with those schools to bring businesses and young people together to help give young people work experience where they show an interest in those firms, and also to ensure that they're well equipped to make the right career choices. And I think it's in that respect particularly important that there's access, direct access to business people and particularly young people who've just entered the world of work and are with those businesses, going back to schools and explaining a bit about the opportunities and the day-to-day what's involved in working to young people. But certainly exposure to the opportunities is massively important. In Ayrshire, Chamber of Commerce there is working with all three Ayrshire local authorities to deliver work experience for young people across Ayrshire and across all three local authorities. And really, I think that's been an important example of, Serene Woods mentioned, I think rightly, the need for business to step up to the plate and ensure that work experience opportunities are available. I remember we did a survey a few years ago, and it was throwing up the result that 90% of businesses wanted young people with work experience prior to them applying to coming into their business, but equally only 10% of employers actually provided that work experience. That's the kind of number we want to change, and Chambers of Commerce across the country are working to ensure that changes. In terms of how we make that more mainstreamed across the country, our chambers talk to each other on a regular basis. We share best practice, and we can implement delivery models that will ensure continuity of service across the country, where that's something that local authorities are prepared to invest in, or indeed Scottish Government. So there's ways and means we can do that. We can spread that best practice across the country where we find systems that work, as we have done in Renfrewshire and Ayrshire. We're certainly more than happy as an organisation to ensure that more of our chambers across the country are able to deliver that service.
Thanks very much for that. I certainly welcome the work that has been done by Renfrewshire Chamber of Commerce and Renfrewshire Council, and hope it can be replicated in other parts of the country. I just wanted to follow up just with a more general question. The committee has focused a lot recently on careers advice and preparing young people for future employment and future career paths. I just wanted to ask you, the panel, a general question. Do you think young people are getting sufficient careers advice, and if you think this could be improved, how do you think the careers advice service could be improved with a view to improving employability for young people?
Could I start there? So first of all, I agree with the comments made on Renfrewshire. It's not my current employer, but my previous employer worked very closely with the Chamber of Commerce, and we brought people in at all different levels, whether they were still at school for work experience, school leavers, college graduates, university graduates. So we did work very closely, and it was a very successful partnership. I think that in the industry I work in, which is ICT, specifically talking about my industry, which is what I know best, I don't think that the careers advice accurately reflects the opportunities that there are in IT, or probably even in STEM generally. So I really welcome the recent announcement about the Skills Investment Plan with £6.5 million for the sector. There are 73,000 IT professionals in Scotland today, contributing £3 billion to the economy. But we can, in a way, the soft skills question would be a luxury for me, because we can fix that, but we can't actually find the skills that we need. So the company I'm currently working for is creating 250 software development jobs in Glasgow, and we really can't find the skills that we need. And we're competing with other companies in financial services, the likes of Amazon, Skyscanner. We are all together looking for hundreds of people now, and the system isn't producing kids with the aspiration to work in the industry. So I think, you know, in terms of business stepping up to the plate, our industry definitely will, because we don't feel we've got the choice. We feel we're going to have to grow our own talent. We're talking to universities, we're talking to colleges. There's a Siemens model in the north of England where they're effectively, that's how they're producing their future staff. So for the IT industry, I think, and for STEM in general, it's a really big issue. And I don't think there's a simple answer. I don't think it's, you know, just down to government or just down to business. I think parents have a role to play. I think parents are perhaps still thinking that they want their children to be lawyers or doctors or accountants, which is great. We need those, but we're producing more lawyers than we have jobs for example, and somehow or other connecting all of the people that influence children, which are their peers, their parents, their teachers, the careers advisors, is something that really needs to change in order for Scotland to be able to continue to succeed and be at the forefront of something the country's always done superbly well, which is STEM, engineering, maths. It's really, you know, I'm from Glasgow, what Glasgow was founded on, and I feel we're missing a trick.
I don't know if anyone else has got any comments on careers advice in schools.
I think I would definitely echo a lot of that. I think one thing that a lot of our members have said is that just as important to getting young people into businesses for work experience is getting teachers into businesses as well. And I think that's one of the aspects that Renfrewshire Chamber have been looking at as well, is trying to get, as well as getting young people into a bit of practical experience in business, getting teachers a bit of practical experience, because, you know, young people need to make, you know, you can't tell young people what choices they're going to make. You need to be able to give them the opportunity to make the right decisions for themselves. In order to do that, you need the right information, and you need the right breadth of information to them. We certainly believe that businesses themselves are a great way of doing that, and we're certainly working with our members to increase the number of businesses that are participating in these schemes. But also, you know, you need to make sure that you know, teachers, parents, etc., are educated as to the opportunities that are out there, and not just the opportunities that are out there just now, but the opportunities that will be out there in 5, 6, 10 years' time. To ensure that young people can make the best possible decisions that they can make about their future careers. And I think as well, one of the other things we mentioned in our submission is you know, not railroading young people at too early a stage in terms of subject choices, keeping it as transferable as possible. You know, right up through to college and university, so that they can reach the decisions that are right for them. And that are right ultimately for the future employers and for the economy. But it's about provision of information. It's about ensuring that not just young people, but everyone involved in the education system is awake and aware of the opportunities that exist in business in Scotland at the moment.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, I've got a couple of questions here, really. I was looking at the Youth Guarantee Europe, and obviously the European Union's keen for members to establish their own youth guarantee scheme, which obviously we have. It says there's funding attached to the EU youth guarantee, although it's assumed that national budgets will prioritise tackling youth unemployment. To what extent do you think we can tap into that as a funding source?
I only know what I read.
I think European Social Fund and other European funding is a great opportunity to embed delivery in Scotland. I would say that it'd be better if it was done at a national level, though, rather than a competition. I mean, if you look at the Priority 5 submissions that were previously, they were then ring-fenced to Skills Development Scotland, colleges, local authorities, SCVO and trade unions, I think. So it was a particular group that was able to apply for funding to add value to the learner journeys it was going through. So I would say, yeah, we should be applying for European funding, but we need to take it at a national perspective on it and ensure that there's like consistent delivery across the country, rather than kind of like postcoded or indeed depending on which sector can bid for the money.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that as well. I mean, in terms of where the resources come from, I mean, employers, will take support wherever they can get it in terms of how they can, employ more young people, particularly. I mean, certainly, we've been, recruiting as an organisation over the past year, and there is a huge wealth of different opportunities that you can access in terms of support for employment, and particularly employing young people. We operate one of those ourselves in partnership with the Scottish Government in terms of our sort of Growing Talent initiative, which is assisting, last year assisted 100 graduates into jobs, and this year is assisting just under 300 into jobs. But it's one of many, many programmes out there. And when you're looking to employ a young person, you're looking to see, well, what does Scottish Chambers of Commerce offer? What does the Scottish Government offer? What does the local authority offer? What does the Commonwealth Jobs Fund offer? There's loads of different things out there, and I think that adds to the complexity that was mentioned earlier on. I think simplifying it, ensuring these schemes are very accessible to employers, and that they go to one place and can find the scheme that best suits their particular needs. That's where we'll get to solutions there. So the sources of funding are probably less important than delivery from our members' perspectives.
Probably complexity leads me to my second question. We've touched before about, for young people in particular, it's very important to be able to track them as they move into employment and training and so forth. When they hit 18, basically the DWP and the job centres and so on have the primary role as far as that's concerned, which means that those that are supporting them, for example SDS and so on, perhaps have less access to information about that young person as they move into employability. Do you see that as a major disconnect? Do you see it as a major issue?
Some contracts are delivered, but I mean some of them are the onus is with the provider who's delivering the service to track clients for a specific period of time, 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever that may be. Again, it'd be good if we could get to a national opportunity to track clients. I think Careers Scotland, SDS, do a good job in tracking first and second destinations, but anything beyond that is a bit of an ask for them, and probably would need again some sort of additional resource to ensure that could be embedded in the delivery. Other things that come along that are good initiatives would be Community Jobs Scotland, where young people are paid the rate for a job for 6 months. It would be great if we could find out how many of these 6 months jobs created was then turned into a real job, and then if there was added value by any of these maybe being an apprenticeship opportunity thereafter, and there was some sort of joining up of learning and funding that took a person from inactivity into whatever was the best possible destination for them, and a tracking mechanism that supports that would be really good.
Does this seem to be an issue that can be resolved, or are the issues around data protection and so on between the different agencies creating barriers?
Data protection tends to be an excuse rather than the reason for not being able to share information. I think in DWP terms now they are relaxing some of the rules around exchanging information. We've got outcome agreements with local authorities, but I would say that there usually isn't a problem in sharing data if it's with the person's authority and support for that. I think it tends to be an excuse rather than the reason.
Briefly, a moment ago, in a first question from Colin Beattie about the youth guarantee question. Can I ask yourself, Mr Murphy, you in your submission from the Scottish Training Federation said that members believe that aspects of this, you welcome very much the youth guarantee as a constitutional right in your submission. Why would you welcome that? What is your reason for welcoming a constitutional guarantee or a constitutional right in terms of the youth guarantee, I should say?
We're already part there because 16 to 18-year-olds are already offered a guarantee through Opportunities for All. So extending that to 25 plus would be a good thing, I would have thought. and make sure that young people are offered that constitutional guarantee of a place.
And in terms of the practical impact of it is really what I'm asking. Does that make a difference to their future employment prospects if we embed that kind of right?
I'm sure it would impact on their ability to contribute to the economy and also give them bona fide work experience and an opportunity to develop beyond that and see their end job as a career destination rather than just a job for a particular period of time. Offering that guarantee, I'm sure, extends that opportunity for them.
Liam MacArthur.
Convener, can I maybe link back Colin and Joan's initial question? I mean, obviously, we operate in a highly integrated market, and there's obvious benefits in having skills that are recognised and portable across that market. But understandably, different governments will have priorities they want to see achieved, and I don't think there's any government that hasn't jealously guarded particular initiatives that they're rolling forward. So, leaving aside the issue of sort of complexity within individual schemes, which I think you all alluded to in answer to Joan's initial question, is it a question of getting both governments and the agencies over which they have control to work more seamlessly together? Or are there aspects of the way in which the kind of division of responsibilities currently lie that could better be kind of reassigned and would address some of the complexity? Probably, I think, Gary, you were talking about the interface between the two. Are there aspects of that could be better aligned to reduce the complexity, even if it doesn't remove it entirely?
I think certainly it could be. How easy it would be to achieve, I'm not sure, but because I think there's a job of work to be done there. But certainly, as an organisation, our own engagement that we have with Skills Development Scotland, which is very extensive, and with DWP, which is maybe less extensive, it's clear to us that although you'll sometimes or quite often find Skills Development Scotland and Job Centre Plus, for example, sharing a building, that's about as far as it goes. There doesn't seem to be the degree of engagement between the two, that they know instinctively what each other are doing and are complementing the work each other's doing. It is solvable, I'm quite sure. But I think there's a long way to go to ensure that
to be a working relationship as opposed to an issue of SDS aren't responsible for this and Job Centre Plus are. It would make more sense and it would work more effectively, and you would have a better working relationship were there a kind of reassignment of some of those responsibilities. I mean, obviously, I'm arguing from the perspective somebody who wants to Scotland remain part of the UK, but recognise that process of devolution has been organic from the outset, and therefore, if there are ways in which things are not working at the moment that could be addressed by better reassigning those responsibilities, then surely to goodness we should be making that.
It's a question of organisations and bodies working in silos. I mean, it's not insurmountable, and you would have to in order to create a solution to this problem, then irrespective of the constitutional framework that we have, solutions will still have to be found. So I think there's a challenge there, whatever happens. But if employers are going to get that one-stop shop that they all tell us that they want, then these organisations are going to have to work together some way or another.
Do you else have any views on that?
I mean, there's a government commitment to that. The Scottish Employability Forum has been created. That's COSLA, Scottish Government, the UK government trying to get together and look at employability and what issues are contained within that. I think gentleman to left is quite correct. It's operationally where it starts to flounder a wee bit, where you're actually trying to force that relationship between government departments or SDS, DWP, Job Centre Plus or whoever. Making that work is the difficult part of the business.
I think also the fact is your actual apprenticeship system is completely different north and south of the border. You've got different qualifications that are embedded within those, and going forward with the changes that are happening in the UK government with apprenticeships, it's only going to add to the complexity and the differentiation between a Scottish apprenticeship and then an English apprenticeship going forward. So there are those challenges regardless of the outcome on the 18th of September.
Will that make a difference in terms of the kind of portability of those qualifications for apprentices who choose to then either move south to north or north to south?
I'm not sure about the apprentices. Once they've been certificated, we'll have a problem. But I think the qualifications at the moment are a challenge in some cases, particularly around the Majesty's forces. Of actually then taking Scottish qualifications and then trying to import them into the English system. That's a difficulty in itself just now.
Is that something that's being looked at? Is it seen as a difficulty that requires a solution, or is it just assumed to be that's the way of things?
I think that's pretty much it is two different systems.
Right.
Yeah, an obvious solution is to have a single integrated system that deals with these problems, rather than trying to bolt the two bits together and find, artificial fixes between two separate systems. Well, it's entirely possible to do. Surely a single integrated system would be a better way of solving that problem. I agree.
Ours is better though, isn't it? So which one do you follow?
I think I know the answer to that question as well. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I was interested in looking at the European Youth Guarantee, because another piece of work the European Union is looking at is workforce planning in some detail. They've just completed a very big review about health workers across the EU. And I was interested with your comments, Maggie. I think you stole most of my question. I also had a 20-year career in IT and very interested in the STEM subjects. But as a member of the cross-party group in science and technology, we've also had presentations from the engineering community about the demographic challenges that are coming that way as well, with most of the qualified engineers about to retire. So I was wondering if you think we could really be doing the workforce planning element of this a bit better. And also, we've talked a bit about employers' responsibility here, but obviously still one of the big problems in the STEM areas is retention of women and also the pay gap in these areas. And do you think employers are really addressing this issue properly?
So I think in terms of gender, there absolutely is an issue. And there's also an issue with age in IT as well. So if I talk to gender first, I think some of what we experience comes from what people were saying earlier around who does what and how children grow up and their perception of their parents, and who does the unpaid work and who does the paid work. I think the industry in general has to do a much better job in attracting women and then holding on to them. And I don't think it's all about women having children. I mean, clearly that's an issue and that presents specific challenges because women are generally the carers. But I think there is there's a bigger industry issue around how the industry looks and feels. And that's something that I think employers need to do better, because I think sometimes, I don't even always think it's conscious. I think there is a tendency just in human nature to employ people who are like you. And so you sort of end up with a boys' club. And, there's lots of studies that have been done around when you anonymise the gender of CVs or when musicians are auditioning for an orchestra and there's a screen so they can't see if it's a male or a female. People make different decisions. But it is something we seriously need to address, because it's a great career that's well paid, that offers lots of opportunities, as you'll know yourself. The age issue, my personal view, and I'm speaking as an individual now rather than an employee, I think we let people down when times were good, actually. And there was a short-termism, and when when things were booming and the economy was very strong, there would be discussions around, well, why would I risk this to someone in their 20s when I know someone in their 30s would be an absolute banker, would do a really good job? And nobody was thinking ahead to what was going to happen when baby boomers retired. Because if you look at most of the IT companies as well as the engineering companies, you know, I was at Cisco. Cisco's average age was 42, IBM's was 48, HP's was 47, and you compare that with a Wipro or an Infosys or IT companies from the developing world, and it's not because they're small, they've got tens of thousands of employees and their average age is 26. So I think now we're being forced to do something, whether it's in engineering or IT or other industries where that's happened, and that's why there's a much greater emphasis on bringing young people in. And so in a way the crisis might actually be a good thing, and a good thing for youth employment as well, because we need to do something now.
Want to come in? Chambers of Commerce?
I think that's right. I think it definitely illustrates as well that the issue over getting the right information to young people who are making, you know, often effectively career choices at a very early stage. And, you know, if you're looking at young people who are going through the system, you know, 5, 10, 15, 5, 10 years ago even, you know, may have looked at for example, the electronics sector as an area in decline because they were seeing the sort of lower skilled assembly jobs going offshore, and they think, well, that's not much of an industry. And you know, my parents were in that industry when it started to emerge in the 70s and 80s, and they might think, well, you know, they lost their jobs, and you know, friends and family have lost their jobs. That's not an area I want to be in. But the truth is that the industry was changing its nature. And that there were new opportunities and high-skilled and high-paid opportunities emerging, which we now have difficulty filling. And I think, to some extent, that could similarly be said of the oil and gas sector as well in the North East, that, you know, we were told constantly that, you know, it had reached its peak and it was in decline. But, you know, none of us really seriously believe that for a minute. And even if it was true, we would still have the high-skilled, high-quality service sector skills that are anchored in the North East of Scotland, and we want to retain them there. So it's about educating and ensuring that young people have the right information and not just a perception of either specific industries or you know, the sort of wider angle that they might look at sort of various job opportunities and say, well, that's not for me because X, Y, and Z. It's got to be the right information, quality information, and allow them to make a better decision that best suits their own talents.
One statistic, we certificate apprentices in Scotland in the last 2 years, 31,000. And through our system, one of the things that I pulled off just before I came out was management. And one of the things from January last year through to this year is almost a 50-50 split between male and female, which again was not probably perceived before looking at something like that. Is females 49 and males 51. So again, I think that look at different sectors, maybe traditionally, I think that has changed.
Just a quick supplementary, Convener. I was interested to see New College Lanarkshire advertising a degree in computing, which I was surprised about because it's not something I'd seen that college doing before. But what they were actually given was an articulation route through an HNC HND degree programme with Napier, and the modern apprenticeships also offer these. Do you think the high-tech companies and the IT companies and engineering are using these opportunities in the right way, and could we be doing more in terms of articulation to specific job targets?
Engineering framework it's not an easy framework to do. It's not an easy apprenticeship. It does have HND and vocational qualifications in there, plus the core skills and then other mandatory qualifications. So I think it does use its full gamut of what's available. And again, if you go up to the technical and professional level, again, there's a growing need for those level of apprenticeships going forward.
Yeah, as an employer, absolutely. You know, we the company I'm working for now, CGI, we are going to take on modern apprentices. We are very interested in how there can be a progression. And also, you know, I think in the UK we've lost a little bit of the pride that there is in vocational learning. At some point, university became the be-all and end-all, I think for the right reasons, but it's had some unintended consequences, and we are very happy to look at modern apprentices, particularly in the area of open source software development. Bright kids could just be doing this on their mobile devices, you know, designing applications. It's not necessarily, we do have a graduate programme, and they'll probably continue to draw the line at 2-1, but where we're looking at establishing this open source centre in Glasgow, we are looking at modern apprentices. We're talking to Motherwell College, we're talking to Glasgow Caledonian University, we're talking about co-creation, and they are interested in bringing people in through that route, so not just people coming straight from school into university. And I think we need to be much more flexible and supportive in our approach, and not just look at, we need bright graduates, but we don't just need bright graduates.
A very brief supplementary. And then Jean Baxter.
Going on with thunder there by actually answering the question before I ask it. But no, I was going to ask about, we were talking about the STEM subjects, and I was at UWS in Paisley not so long ago, and obviously their heart and soul of the university's engineering, because it was a technical college in the past. Now, they work very closely with Renfrewshire Chamber as well, but their fear is that, you know, I was along, it was a competition for young people second year to do engineering problems to deal with it, and there was 50-50 young men and young women. It was a great demographic, it was a politician's dream. But when I asked the question of the lecturers, he says, we don't get that by the time it gets to university. He says, sometimes I feel like I should just maybe advertise the potential earnings in their career in order to tell them that, you know, kids, this is a good future for you. You know, where are we going? Where are we? That information which you already mentioned yourself, where is that information? In areas like Renfrewshire where it is working, we still aren't managing to get young people into industries that we need them to get into, and also, which would probably give them a very good future as well. You know, how are we not enthusing them to get into the STEM subjects in particular?
I wish I knew the answer to that. We even thought about where we had, and this is tongue-in-cheek, but where we had parents coming with kids, that we put something like, worried about your retirement, send your children in this direction because they'll earn well. I do think it's probably, and it's not, my mum was a teacher, it's absolutely not to apportion blame at all. This industry, I think what Gary said was true about Silicon Glen, but these are different jobs now that we're looking at. And I think perhaps teachers and parents, we haven't done a good enough job of outlining the opportunities to them. I mean, if you just look at the rise of something like Facebook, which is apparently mostly now people my age using Facebook, not the youngsters anymore, that phenomenon has happened within the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And parents that were at university or teachers that studied long ago just haven't seen the evolution. So I wonder, you know, how can we inspire them and keep them up to date and help them to understand what was out there? Because if I graduated in 1983, if I'd gone straight into teaching and stayed there, I wouldn't know unless I made an effort to find out, or unless there was some way of keeping me fresh and current with the opportunities that are out there. And ditto, you know, career advisors. There are YouTube links and now appearing will.i.ams on it about how trendy coding is, and the founder of Facebook and the founder of other organisations. And I think it's about something that we need to do to get those people that the kids think are hip and cool and that have demonstrated entrepreneurship to be more effective role models. And you know, as an industry, we need to do a better job as well.
I think as well it underlines the need to break down those barriers between academic and vocational qualifications, and you know, I don't want to be bashing teachers either, but a lot of teachers have gone through the academic route and that's what they know. And I remember speaking to someone who said their son was wanting to go and take on an engineering apprenticeship, and the teacher at his school attempted to dissuade him from doing that, saying, no, you're bright, you go to university, because that's what they've done, and you know, that's their experience. And you know, and again, I think that's why Serene Wood's report is going to be so influential and important to all of this, because it is about trying to do something meaningful to break down those barriers between vocational and academic, and have you know, and not necessarily even separate out children, because we don't want that kind of, you know, well, you're going down this path and you're going down this path and you'll never see each other again for the rest of your life. It's about bringing vocational education into part of the mainstream. And again, there's an awful lot of opportunities, and a lot of high-paid opportunities, as you mentioned, down those routes. And you know, to be honest, if that child had gone, you know, followed the teacher's advice and become a, you know, speaking as a reformed lawyer myself, had gone down the route of the legal profession rather than take an engineering apprenticeship, he would probably be in a worse position today. So.
Reformed are welcome. Thank you very much for that. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. We may have touched on some of the answers to the questions I'm going to ask, but if you feel you want to add anything to what you said before, then I'd be pleased to hear it. I'm looking at two pieces of written evidence that we've had this morning. One was from Unison Scotland to the earlier session, and it points out that admission to universities is lower in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK for students from lower socio-economic backgrounds. And then in the answer to the last couple of questions, we've talked about progression and young people's aspirations. And then I'm looking at the submission from the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, Gary, and you've got some, I don't know if it was you, but somebody from your organisation's got some really good ideas, it seems to me, about reforming the university sector and reforming the structure of courses and the timing of courses. Do you think that if we did that, it would improve participation rates, or do you think there are other barriers that young people from those backgrounds encounter?
Well, I think what we're effectively trying to illustrate there is the need to ensure a degree of flexibility and transferability right the way through from probably the beginning of secondary education, right the way throughout education, through to further and higher education. It's about ensuring that there's always an opportunity for young people to sort of realise, well, maybe this isn't the career path for me, but now I've gone too far, and you know, there's no route out of that. It's about ensuring that there's always forks in the road that they can choose and do something that is more suited to them, or more suited to you know, their perception of what the opportunities are. And we would hope we could improve their perception of opportunities out there. But I think university education, I mean, one of the things we've said is that the structure at the moment was, you know, designed a very long time ago. You know, we've got, you know, by and large, 4-year degree courses. Is that necessary? Could we reduce the cost to the young person going through university by shortening the degree course? Could we make it more attractive for overseas students to come in and take up degree courses in this country? Could we make it less expensive for employers to put members of staff through university as part of their career progression? It's about trying to design a system, or make the system. We've got a good system. We've got 5 universities in the top 200 in the world. There's a good system out there. Let's make it more flexible, more adaptive, and more reflective of business in the 21st century in Scotland. And all we're looking for there is a degree of further flexibility to allow you know, young people who want to go through that particular path. And I say we shouldn't be railroading everyone towards university. We should have a very clear and attractive option of vocational training at an earlier stage. But the important thing is that we then open up those opportunities as people go through the path of education, and make it as flexible as possible.
I would agree with that. I mean, as an organisation ourselves, we've got 3 graduates working for us who are now undertaking apprenticeships. And we also have somebody who came from college who's now undertaking an apprenticeship, and then somebody straight from school. So I do think there's flexibility there, and there is the progression routes to move on.
And I think, like, you know, Glasgow Caledonian are moving in that direction. They're looking at how they, I think 96% of their graduates are employed within 6 months of graduation, but they're looking at, and they obviously, like UWS, they take more from the more deprived areas and have a degree of success. They're also looking at bringing people in through college partnerships, and they've been very flexible with us. At my current employer, when I was saying, look, we can't find these skill sets, they were saying, what do you need? Can we co-design something together? And as complete coincidence, because it wasn't deliberate, at my previous employer, when I went to see them, it turned out that 17 of the 37 graduates we'd taken on in Erskine were from Glasgow Caledonian, which kind of speaks to they obviously interviewed well, and they came across as the type of graduate we would want to employ. I wonder if there's maybe something around the MOOCs as well, these massive open courses that are free. However, I think, you know, along with the work that other agencies do in helping people to get into employment, the fact that the online content is free is one thing, but you need the digital access to get to it, and then you probably need a degree of support to keep you know, motivated throughout. But, you know, just building on what Gary said, I think there's lots and lots of things we can do.
I was listening there, but thanks. That was.
And final question from Joan.
Thank you, Convener. If I could steer us back towards employability, obviously welfare is in the hands of the Westminster and Department of Work and Pensions, and the Welfare Reform Committee that sits today is hearing some evidence from a number of charities who are concerned about some of the incentives for getting people into work that the Department of Work and Pensions are now using, in particular the use of sanctions to cut people's benefit if they don't reach certain levels of phone calls to look for jobs and so on. There's a lot of concern about the way that huge jump in the number of people whose benefits have been cut because of these sanctions, which were toughened up last October. I just wondered if you thought that was the best way to incentivise people into work. No.
No, I don't. I mean, I think, you know, work should be presented as something that is rewarding, not just from a financial perspective, but from the perspective of building self-esteem and feeling worthwhile. And I absolutely understand, it was alluded to earlier, that there are serious issues with budgets that are only going to get worse. And, you know, I'm sure I'm not making a party political comment. I'm sure that people think this is the answer. I think people should be incentivised to work for all the right reasons and not almost punished into working.
I think if there are people with that attitude, I mean, it's probably something that there's been a systemic failure at some point in their lives. That's probably happened a lot earlier on. I'm not sure that there's a simple way of suddenly just turning the corner there. That there needs to be more work done with that person. But I think more importantly, you know, we need to ensure that less people emerge like that. And I think the way to do that is by having a better engagement and a better linkage with the world of work at an early stage, so that we don't end up with people in that position that you know, there are other challenges in terms of trying to get these people back into employment and keeping them there. You know, and that's we'd be here for another hour talking about that. But essentially, we need to do more with people at a far earlier stage before they get to that stage.
Because in some cases people are being left destitute, so they can't actually travel to to job centres and so on to find work as a result of having the benefits.
Yeah, and particularly in remote and rural areas, it's not often easy to access employment opportunities, training opportunities, or indeed the practicalities. So, you know, there are big challenges there.
Okay, thank you.
The process by which people do become sanctioned, and if that was understood better, then it would probably be easier for people not to be sanctioned. But I think you're right. The incentive should be to do something positive in your life rather than to keep using benefit. And if we can articulate a positive message rather than using the sanction word, which isn't a very nice word, it doesn't get presented as something that's a punishable exercise rather than something that's a bit more rewarding.
Okay, thank you very much. Everybody for coming along today. I do appreciate you taking the time out, I'm sure, of your busy schedules to come along and give us your evidence. We very much appreciate it, and I will briefly suspend so that we can allow the witnesses to leave the table. Thank you. Is to consider two negative instruments, the Coatbridge College Transfer and Closure Scotland Order 2014 and the Teachers Superannuation Scotland Miscellaneous Amendments Regulations 2014. Do members have any comments they wish to make on these instruments? There's no comments, therefore I'll put the question. Does the committee agree to make no recommendation to the Parliament on these instruments? Agreed. Thank you very much. Before I move on to that, I just want to say on the public record, this is Joan McAlpine's final meeting with the Education and Culture Committee. She's been with us since the last election in 2011, so she's with us for the whole session so far. She's moving on to the Economy Committee, I believe, hopefully, once the Parliament agrees that, obviously. But can I just put on record my thanks for Joan's effort and support over the last nearly 3 years on this committee. And I'm sure I speak for all members when we say thank you very much for all of the input you've put, particularly into the legislation we've undertaken, but I have to say particularly into the inquiries we took into looked after children, and I thank you very much for your work and effort over the last 3 years. Thank you very much, Joan. We have previously agreed to take our final agenda item in private, and so I close the public part of the meeting.